Hey there. Tonight, I want to ask you something that sounds almost too large for the mind to hold. What did Earth feel like when all the continents were one? Because there was a time, long before people, long before birdsong as we know it, long before the Atlantic opened its dark blue seam, when the world gathered itself into a single body of land so enormous that distance stopped feeling human. There were no familiar coastlines to reassure you. No separate Americas. No Africa apart from Europe. No India adrift on its own long future. There was one vast continent, one unbroken sweep of stone and desert and forest, and beneath that still-looking surface, the planet was already preparing to break it all apart again. If that kind of deep time draws you in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and settle in with me for the journey. Now let the room grow dim. Let your shoulders drop. Unclench the small muscles around your eyes. Breathe in slowly, and breathe out even more slowly. We are going very far back tonight, to a world so old that even the ground beneath your feet would not recognize its own future shape. I have always found it strange that people say the word Pangea as if it were only a diagram in a school book. A neat idea. A puzzle piece trick. But if you were standing there with me, on that ancient Earth, it would not feel neat at all. It would feel overwhelming. The first thing you would notice is scale. Not just the size of the land itself, though that would be enough to quiet almost anyone, but the way scale changed your sense of direction, your sense of weather, even your sense of loneliness. You could begin walking across that world and keep walking east without meeting the kind of ocean that now interrupts every map in your head. You could cross from what would one day be North America into what would later become Europe and Asia, then drift south toward Africa, and the land would simply continue, changing slowly around you, never once asking you to board a ship. There was one global ocean beyond it all, Panthalassa, immense and circling, but the land itself held nearly everything together in one severe embrace. Honestly, that is what makes the age of Pangea so haunting to me. Not just that the world was different, but that it was unified in a way that now feels almost mythic. One horizon, one body of land, one giant experiment in climate and survival. To understand that world, we have to set aside the map we carry around without realizing it. That quiet modern map lives behind the eyes. Continents floating apart. Coastlines we recognize instantly. The blue of the Atlantic separating old from new. The Pacific spanning the center of the globe like an ancient silence. None of that belonged to the age we are entering. The Earth then was arranged according to older tensions, older pressures. Continents had drifted for ages, collided, fused, and finally pressed themselves into a single supercontinent. It was not a peaceful gathering. The rocks remembered too much for that. Beneath the crust, heat moved slowly through the mantle, and the plates above it drifted as they always have. Only a few centimeters in a year. Almost nothing at the scale of a human life, but enough to remake the world when given tens of millions of years. Earlier supercontinents had already come and gone. Rodinia, Pannotia, names that sound almost whispered. Each one assembled, each one torn apart. Earth has a habit of bringing its scattered pieces together, then letting them wander then calling them back again. Pangea was one chapter in that deeper cycle, but it was one of the most dramatic because its unity changed so much at once. Long before it fully formed, the planet was a patchwork of drifting lands. Laurentia, Gondwana, Baltica, Siberia, smaller fragments besides. They moved over ancient oceans that no longer exist except as folded memory in the rocks. One ocean narrowed, another closed. Coastlines that had once faced open water were driven into collision. When continents meet, they do not slip past one another politely. They crush. They wrinkle. Stone behaves like cloth under enough pressure, though it takes millions of years to show it. Mountains rose where once there had been shallow seas. Island chains were trapped, uplifted, and buried. The future Appalachian Mountains began as part of one of these long collisions. So did parts of mountain belts now split apart by oceans. What is today eastern North America and what is now Northwest Africa once leaned against one another in that old geological press. If you were there in those ages before Pangea fully settled, you would not see the motion directly. That is part of the eeriness. The world would seem stable to your eyes. Mountains fixed, rivers flowing, forests spreading where rain allowed. Yet every ridge, every basin, every coastline would be moving in a timescale too slow for flesh to feel. I think that is one reason deep time can be so calming if you let it. It reminds you that not all important motion is visible. Some of the largest changes happen in silence, with no audience at all. As the continents drew closer, oceans between them shrank. The Reich Ocean, once broad and open, was slowly squeezed out of existence. Marine basins vanished. Sediments were folded and lifted. Great mountain systems formed along the stitched seams of the planet. And at last, over immense spans of time, the fragments became one. Pangea emerged not as a sudden event, but as a gradual gathering. A continent built by patience and pressure. A continent whose size would shape every cloud, every river, every migration path, every chance at survival. By the late Paleozoic, especially around the Permian and just before it, this supercontinent had become a dominating fact of the world. It sprawled across the planet with a geographical arrogance that modern continents no longer possess. Much of it straddled the equator, while its northern and southern reaches extended into very different climate zones. That meant one connected land could contain tropical forests, seasonal plains, harsh deserts, and colder reaches all at once. No other familiar map prepares you for that. It was one world, yes, but not one mood. Near some coasts and river systems, the land was green and heavy with life. Wetlands spread across low ground. Dense stands of ancient plants rose in the warmth. Rivers meandered through broad floodplains, carrying sediment from young mountain belts into fertile basins. In older periods, especially during the Carboniferous, great swamp forests had flourished in some of these regions. Their decaying vegetation would one day become the coal seams humans dig from the earth, holding in black layers the breath of vanished forests. The air during some of those ages may have held more oxygen than ours does now. Enough, perhaps, to support astonishingly large arthropods. Dragonflies with wingspans that would make a modern room feel suddenly too small. Millipede-like creatures moving through the leaf litter with a softness that feels almost impossible until you remember that Earth was once willing to try nearly anything. But Pangea was not simply a paradise of giant forests and strange animals. The farther inland you traveled, the more severe the land became. This is one of the central truths of that ancient world. The very thing that made Pangea remarkable, its immense unity, also made its interior harsh beyond easy comparison. Moist ocean air could only travel so far. Rain fell near the coasts, near mountain slopes where air rose and cooled, near the great river corridors. Then the moisture was spent. What remained beyond that reach were continental interiors on a scale modern Earth scarcely knows. Dry country, red country, a land of heat in the day and deep cooling at night. Vast deserts and arid plains stretching outward under a sky so broad it would make even silence feel exposed. Geologists still read this story in red beds, those iron-stained sediments laid down under hot, dry conditions. These rocks are the quiet afterimage of Pangea's interior deserts. Their color alone tells you something about the chemistry of old air and old sun. I imagine standing there, boots sinking slightly into warm dust, the horizon trembling in summer heat. No scent of salt anywhere. No promise of a nearby sea. Only distance and more distance, broken by far mountains or the line of a river if you were lucky enough to be near one. The climate of that interior was probably fierce in its contrasts. Summers oppressive. Winters in some regions unexpectedly cold. With so much land far from the ocean's moderating breath, temperature could swing hard between seasons and between day and night. This is one of those details that changes the emotional feel of Pangea for me. It was not simply warm and prehistoric in the lazy way people sometimes imagine the ancient world. It could be brutal, dry, wind scraped. Rain was uncertain. Life there had to become efficient or disappear. And still, life found its way through all of it. That may be the gentlest miracle in the story. Along the coasts, humid belts of vegetation flourished. Seed ferns spread broad fronds across the land. Early conifers rose in stronger, drier places. In wetter lowlands, horsetails and other ancient plants clustered near rivers and swamps. Insects moved through these systems in numbers and forms that would have startled a modern eye. Amphibians lingered near water. Reptiles, carrying the innovation of the amniotic egg, began to step farther into the dry world. They were no longer tethered to ponds and marshes for reproduction in the way older lineages had been. That changed everything. I like to linger here for a moment, because it is easy to pass over the importance of that one adaptation. A shell, membranous, a self-contained nursery for life. Such a small thing to describe. Such a large thing to inherit. Because once vertebrates could reproduce fully on land, the interior of Pangea opened to them in a new way. Deserts were still hard. River valleys still mattered. But now the dry country was no longer forbidden. It became a frontier. Some of the creatures that moved across Pangea in those ages would seem unsettling to us, though I prefer to think of them as earnest experiments. Synapsids, for example, the line that would one day lead toward mammals, were already present and diversifying. Some had sails on their backs, perhaps for temperature regulation, perhaps for display. Some were heavy plant eaters. Some were active predators. They were not mammals. Not yet. But in their skull openings, their teeth, their body plans, there were hints of a future that had not arrived. The world was already sketching us in very faint lines. And above them all, the sky was doing its own work. Winds over Pangea were shaped by the continent's gigantic mass. On a modern Earth, oceans and scattered continents break the flow of air into more complicated regional systems. On Pangea, the winds could run for immense distances. Monsoonal patterns may have become especially powerful in some zones, with the seasonal heating and cooling of that vast landmass drawing air inland and then sending it away again. Dust from interior deserts could travel far, settling over distant forests, river valleys, perhaps even coastal waters. The whole continent was a connected machine. Dry interior, wet margin, mountain seam, river corridor, wind belt, all of it affecting all the rest. That connectedness matters. It meant plants and animals could spread across extraordinary distances without encountering an oceanic barrier. A species in what is now Africa might also leave fossils in South America or India because, at the time, those lands were not separated by sea. This is one of the clues that first helped scientists reconstruct the old supercontinent. Matching fossils, matching rock layers, matching mountain roots, like a broken object patiently fitted back together. It is debated, in some details, exactly how certain climate zones shifted through different intervals of Pangea's existence, because this story spans many millions of years, and Earth was never fixed even then. But the larger picture is clear. One vast supercontinent. Harsh interior, wetter coasts, restless tectonics, rivers acting like threads through a giant fabric of land. Life spreading where it could, adapting where it must. And perhaps that is what I want you to rest with as this first part draws to its quiet edge. Not a cartoon of ancient Earth, not a neat textbook panel, but a breathing world. A world of red deserts and long rivers, of folded mountain scars and monsoon skies, of forests breathing out old oxygen into strange air, of reptiles testing dry ground and synapsids moving through the undergrowth while the future slept invisibly inside them. Pangea was whole, but it was not still. Beneath that colossal unity, the Earth remained restless, and in the next part, we will move deeper into its climates, its forests, its creatures, and the living texture of that one boundless world. If you have settled a little deeper into the chair now, keep that feeling with you, because this next stretch of the journey is where Pangea becomes less like an abstraction and more like a place you could almost touch. We have the shape of the land now. One supercontinent. One world gathered into itself. But what was daily reality like across that immense body of Earth? What did the coast feel like? What kind of silence lived in the deserts? What breathed in the forests? What crossed the rivers at dusk? The answer depends very much on where you stood. Because Pangea contained so many climates inside one connected land that walking across it would have felt like moving through several planets stitched side by side. Let us begin at the edge, where land met the world ocean. Along the coasts of Pangea, Panthalassa breathed against the continent with a steadiness the interior could only envy. Moisture came in from the sea. Rain fell more reliably. Rivers found their way to tidal flats and shallow basins. Life concentrated there with a richness that the continental center rarely knew. In some coastal regions, broad floodplains spread out green and humid, carrying the scent of wet soil, racine, and slow decay. There were forests here, ancient in pattern and strange in detail. Seed ferns lifted their fronds in layered canopies. Early conifers rose above them, their forms familiar enough to seem almost modern until you looked too long and saw how different the whole community really was. These coasts were not peaceful in a simple way. They were alive. Insects hummed. Wetlands held amphibians among reeds and muddy margins. Early reptiles moved through shadow and light, no longer entirely tied to water, but still often drawn to it. Rivers wandered across the lowlands in long, patient curves, dropping silt, feeding vegetation, then shifting again with flood seasons. Some regions may have looked almost lush enough to comfort a traveler. Honestly, if a person from the present could survive the air and the unfamiliar animal life, the coasts might be the only parts of Pangea that would sometimes feel faintly welcoming. But even there, the welcome came with reminders that this was not our world. The atmosphere was not constant through the whole span of Pangea's existence. In some earlier intervals, oxygen had been higher than today, perhaps high enough to support enormous arthropods. Later, especially into the Permian, oxygen levels seemed to have declined, while carbon dioxide and volcanic influence shifted climate and stress across the land. Some scholars argue about the exact percentages in particular slices of time, because the record is broad and the Earth was changing continuously. But the general picture remains striking. The air itself was an active force in shaping the bodies that lived beneath it. You can see that story most vividly in the old insect world. It still startles me, even after reading about it for years, that the sky above some of those forests may once have carried dragonflies with wingspans near the length of a human arm. Giant millipede-like arthropods moved through thick leaf litter. Beetles, early roach-like insects, and other invertebrates filled the damp understory with constant, small labor. They fed, tunneled, broke down plant matter, became food in turn. Every ancient forest has its own hidden machine beneath the leaves, and Pangea's coasts had theirs. The forests themselves deserve to be walked through slowly. If you were standing with me there, perhaps near a river in a humid lowland, the first thing you might notice would be the density, not necessarily the exact look of each plant, since many lineages from that time have no perfect modern equivalent, but the feeling of layered life. Thick undergrowth in wet places, trunks rising from dark ground, fronds broad enough to gather the pale, filtered light, air that stayed close to the skin, water moving somewhere nearby, sometimes seen, sometimes only heard, and all of it working on the atmosphere, drawing in carbon dioxide, breathing out oxygen, storing their own histories in wood and leaf and root. Farther from these lush margins, the land began to loosen. Forest became more open. Moisture thinned. River corridors still mattered enormously, because they acted like green threads, sewing otherwise difficult country together. Some of Pangea's rivers were vast, beginning in mountain belts, raised by old continental collisions, then winding for extraordinary distances through plains and basins, before reaching a coast or disappearing into inland lowlands, without modern ocean barriers cutting the land apart. A single river system could tie together regions that today would belong to separate continents. That thought alone is enough to quiet the mind. A river beginning in one future continent and watering another before there was any sea between them. These waterways were not just scenic details. They were the great organizers of life. Along their banks, vegetation thickened. Insects gathered. Amphibians bred. Reptiles hunted. Herbivores followed the dependable green of floodplains. Predators followed the herbivores. In the drier parts of Pangea, a river was not merely water. It was structure. It was movement. It was a route through severity. Fossil beds preserve this again and again. Trackways crossing old mud. Bones laid down in river sediment. Flood deposits carrying the history of whole ecosystems in layered silence. I think river valleys on Pangea must have had a feeling of relief about them, even for creatures that could not think such a thing consciously. Shade after glare, mud after dust, growth after scarcity. You know that feeling when a harsh landscape suddenly softens, and your whole body understands it before your mind does. That is how I imagine the great river corridors of the supercontinent. And then there was the interior. We touched it already, but here we should walk deeper into it, because the heart of Pangea was one of the strangest climate zones Earth has ever made. The sheer size of the supercontinent kept so much of its middle far from the moisture-bearing influence of the sea. Ocean air arrived at the continental margins, lost its rain, and weakened before reaching the center. What remained was dryness on an immense scale. Arid plains, red sediment, seasonal violence, heat by day, cooling by night, wind writing its own script into dunes, stone, and dust. These were not little deserts tucked between mountain systems. They may have stretched for astonishing distances. Modern deserts feel enormous to us because we know them through human travel. Pangea's interior deserts belonged to geological imagination instead. Sand and rock running outward beneath a pale sky. Temporary rivers after rare rains. Salt flats in some basins. Long seasonal absences of cloud. Perhaps the occasional distant mountain front. Blue at the edge of vision, marking where another climate began. The rocks preserve this world in red beds and wind-laid sediments. And even now, those formations feel dry to the eye. I have always thought that the color alone carries a mood. Rust red, burnt brown, a shade suggesting oxidation, exposure, and time. If you had walked there, your world might have narrowed to shade, water, and the reading of distances. Plants still lived, of course, but they changed character. Tougher forms, deep roots, smaller leaves, conifers in drier belts, shrubs and hardy growth around watercourses and uplands. Life did not vanish. It leaned inward. Animals adapted by leaning inward, too. Burrowing, conserving water, timing activity to cooler hours. Some of the small vertebrates of the interior may have spent daylight hidden below ground or in narrow shade, emerging when the heat loosened its grip. Others traveled farther between resources, turning endurance into a survival strategy. That is one of the great lessons of Pangea's interior. In harsh systems, life often does not win by speed. It wins by efficiency. Among the most important land animals of this wider age were the Synapsids. Not true reptiles in the later sense, not mammals either, but a profound bridge between worlds. Some were predators. Some were herbivores. Some grew large and carried heavy bodies over open ground. Some remained smaller and more nimble. The famous sail-backed Dimetrodon belonged to an earlier chapter and is often placed mentally among dinosaurs by people who have only seen the outline. But it came long before them. That alone makes me smile a little. Deep time loves to embarrass our neat categories. There were also Therapsids, more advanced Synapsids whose bodies and skulls begin to hint at future mammalian traits. Limbs shifting toward more efficient posture, teeth becoming more specialized. Predators like Gorgonopsids carrying long saber-like teeth. Herbivores like Dicynodonts cropping vegetation with beaked mouths and moving through multiple environments with remarkable flexibility. These were serious animals of a serious world. Not ornamental curiosities. They were shaping ecosystems, competing, feeding, enduring, and quietly testing body plans that would matter for ages to come. If you picture them moving through a drying plain or along a floodplain margin, the world begins to feel real again. Dust near the ground. A herd pausing where green growth thickens near a channel. A predator holding back in sparse cover. Wind over dry stems. Clouds building very far away and perhaps never arriving. The emotional tone of Pangea, to me, is never one of simple abundance. Even in its fertile places there is a sense of scale, of exposure, of systems larger than anything alive within them. And yet, there was beauty. Strange beauty, but beauty all the same. The coastal forests under a warm haze after rain. The open floodplains holding pools that mirror a sky unbroken by modern geography. The first light touching a line of conifers. The huge stillness of the interior under stars. The sound of air moving over a world not yet divided into the continents we know. I think it would have been lonely to stand there, but also clarifying. No cities. No harbors. No names we recognize. Just Earth in one of its more absolute moods. The ocean surrounding all of this, Pantalassa, deserves its own quiet attention. It wrapped the supercontinent on nearly every side. A global sea so immense that even from shore it must have seemed unending. Along continental margins, shallow waters supported marine life, reefs, fish, invertebrates, the long complex food webs that thrive where sunlight reaches the seabed. Farther out lay deep water and currents moving around the great landmass in planetary loops. Ocean circulation, climate, and atmosphere all spoke to one another. The coasts of Pangea were where that conversation became visible. Wet winds, tidal flats, storm belts, inland seas lingering like memories of older oceans. One such memory was the Paleotethys, an ancient seaway along one side of the supercontinent. It was not the dominant global ocean, but it mattered. Shallow marine habitats often matter more than their size suggests. They become cradles of continuity while deeper systems shift around them. In some sheltered waters, life could flourish in ways the harsher open ocean did not always allow. Above all of this moved the sky. Winds over Pangea may have been simpler in some global patterns and more severe in their local effects, precisely because of the continent's arrangement. Large monsoonal systems likely developed as the land heated and cooled seasonally. In wetter zones, rains could be intense. Rivers swelled. Floodplains spread. In the interior, those same atmospheric systems might fail to deliver relief. Dry air reclaimed the land. Dust traveled. Silence returned. The sky over Pangea was not passive scenery. It was machinery. Volcanoes added their own language. Along fault zones and rift regions, eruptions broke the horizon, feeding the atmosphere with ash, sulfur compounds, water vapor, and carbon dioxide. Some eruptions were local in impact. Others altered climate on wider scales. Sulfur aerosols could cool the world temporarily by reflecting sunlight. Carbon dioxide could deepen greenhouse warming over longer spans. Ash could darken skies and settle into river systems and forests. Fire from below was part of the supercontinent's pulse. Even in still-looking ages, Pangea was never truly resting. That restlessness mattered because the same heat below the crust that helped assemble Pangea would one day begin to unmake it. But not yet. For now, the continent still held. The coasts remained wet enough for forests and wetlands. The interiors remained dry enough to test endurance. Rivers still tied mountains to lowlands. Life still crossed enormous distances without touching an ocean. This is the strange comfort of the middle chapter. The world had become one, and for a long while that oneness itself shaped evolution. Without ocean barriers separating major land populations, species could spread widely. The same kinds of animals and plants could occupy regions now split by whole seas. Fossils found in Africa, South America, India, even parts of Antarctica tell versions of the same story. Once these lands were neighbors. Once life walked between them on open ground. Once one climate system, however varied, held them in a shared planetary rhythm. If you were a traveler in that time, and somehow spared the practical dangers of not belonging there, you might have learned to read Pangea, not by political or continental names, but by transitions. Wet to dry, lowland to upland, river to floodplain, forest to open ground, red bed to dune field, monsoon belt to rain shadow. The world was continuous, but continuity does not mean sameness. That is perhaps the deepest lesson of the supercontinent. Unity can still contain vast internal difference, and that internal difference prepared life for harder trials to come. Because underneath the beauty, underneath the forests and the broad rivers and the borderless migrations, Pangea was storing tension. in its crust, in its atmosphere, in its ecosystems, in the delicate relationship between volcanic outgassing, climate, ocean chemistry, and survival. The land may have seemed permanent if you stood upon it for a day, perhaps even for generations, had any human generations existed there. But deep permanence is something Earth rarely grants. In the next part, we will move closer to the living creatures that ruled this connected world, the mammal-like lineages, the reptiles, the forests that fed them, and the darker turning point when fire and extinction nearly emptied Pangea of its voice. By now, the world of Pangea has begun to feel a little more solid around us. You can almost sense the heat rising from the long interior plains, and hear the wetter coasts breathing beneath their forests. In this part of the journey, I want to bring you closer to the creatures themselves, especially the strange line of animals that carried, almost secretly, the early architecture of mammal life inside their bodies. Because before the age of the great dinosaurs fully arrived, before the world split into separate continents, Pangea belonged for a long while to forms of life that seemed to stand in a doorway between old Earth and the Earth that would come later. The Synapsids are at the center of that doorway. They are often described in a way that makes them sound awkward, almost unfinished, as if they were only rough drafts. I think that is unfair. If you were standing on Pangea watching them move through the low light of morning, or across a dry floodplain under a high white sky, you would not think of them as incomplete. You would think of them as perfectly made for the world they inhabited. They were diverse, successful, and in many regions dominant. Their story matters not only because they came before mammals, but because they reveal how evolution often works, patiently, quietly, carrying future possibilities inside present survival. What made them distinctive, at least in skeletal terms, was a single opening behind each eye socket in the skull. It sounds like a tiny anatomical detail, and yet it mattered enormously. That opening allowed room for stronger jaw muscles. Stronger jaw muscles allowed new ways of feeding, biting, tearing, grinding, and new ways of feeding open whole landscapes of opportunity. In deep time, a change in the skull can become a change in destiny. Some of the earlier synapsids had bodies that modern viewers would find almost dreamlike. Dimetrodon is the famous example. Though it lived before the full maturity of Pangea and before dinosaurs, its long body, low posture, and tall sail make it look theatrical, almost invented. But that sail may have served a practical role in regulating temperature, warming quickly under morning light, perhaps helping the animal manage the difficult swings between cool dawn and hotter day. Some scholars debate exactly how much of the sail's function was about temperature and how much may have involved display, because nature is rarely content with one single use for a striking structure. Either way, the effect is unforgettable. Picture one standing near a river margin, the sail rising above the low vegetation, the skin catching pale light while mist lifts from the ground. But Pangea held far more than just the famous forms. There were herbivorous synapsids with thick bodies and heavy stomachs built to process fibrous plants. There were smaller insect hunters moving through root shadow and leaf litter. There were increasingly advanced Therapsids, more refined in their posture, more efficient in their jaws, and perhaps in some cases already hinting at warmer metabolism and more active lives. If you look closely at this line of life, you begin to notice a quiet direction. Legs held a little more beneath the body. Teeth differentiated into more specific roles. Heads carried sensory changes that suggest sharper engagement with the world. This is the sort of detail I find deeply soothing, not because it is small, but because it is cumulative. Evolution does not usually arrive with trumpets. It arrives through accumulated adjustments. A stronger bite, a slightly more upright gait, a body that retains heat a little better, a jaw joint shifting, almost imperceptibly on the scale of ages. These are the motions that eventually create fur, milk, warm blood, and the alert bright eyes of mammalian life. On Pangea, those future things had not yet fully appeared, but the line leading toward them was already moving. Therapsids were among the most important of these later synapsids. Some were predators, lithe and efficient, carrying long teeth and focused skulls. Gorgonopsids are perhaps the best known among them, with saber-like canines and bodies built for decisive movement. They must have seemed formidable on the open ground, especially in the drier regions, where cover was limited and speed mattered. Yet even they were not monsters in the childish sense. They were part of a web. They hunted because the landscape supported prey. They existed because plant eaters had found ways to draw energy from ancient vegetation spread across plains and river systems. Those plant eaters were equally important. Dinosaurs, for instance, were widespread and adaptable herbivores. Some had tusks. Some had beaked mouths suited to clipping tough plants. Their bodies were sturdy, practical, made for endurance. Fossils of dicynodont relatives appear across widely separated modern continents, and that alone carries a hush to it. Africa, South America, India, Antarctica, the same broad family of life once walked all these regions because once they were joined, a single continent preserves these silent repetitions. Bone after bone, basin after basin, telling the same old truth. The world was one. In the wetter zones of Pangea, these animals likely moved through corridors of vegetation beside rivers, floodplains, and lowlands where plant growth was richer. In drier regions, they would have followed seasonal green belts, patches of reliable water, and the narrow ecological openings that the continental interior allowed. A large herbivore on Pangea was never simply eating. It was reading weather, distance, soil moisture, plant density, and risk. Even without conscious reflection, its body was a map-reading instrument, tuned by survival. Predators read the same map. To watch a dry season deepen across the interior would be to watch movement intensify around what remained. Rivers shrink. Pools separate from channels. Vegetation concentrate in narrowing strips. Herbivores gather. Predators wait. The geometry of life becomes sharper in difficult climates. This, too, is one of Pangea's great themes. Its size did not merely allow diversity, it amplified tension. Near the coasts, life could spread and thicken. Far inland, scarcity taught precision. And then there were the smaller synapsids, less dramatic perhaps to a human eye, but no less important in the story. Some of them were close to the line that would eventually produce true mammals. Small insectivores, quick-moving, perhaps active in cooler hours, perhaps more able than their larger relatives to survive periods of stress. Smallness on ancient Earth is often underestimated. We tend to notice the large sails, the heavy skulls, the obvious jaws. But when climates turn severe, when ecosystems fracture, when extinction begins to whisper at the edges of the world, it is often the small, the flexible, the efficient that hold on longest. This matters because Pangea would not remain merely a stage for expansion. It would become the setting for one of the darkest biological events in Earth's history. But before we reach that shadow, we should stay a little longer with the texture of ordinary life. Imagine a late afternoon in a river plain where the air is warm and dusty at the edge of a wetter corridor. Insects rise in the last light. A herd animal pauses to feed on low, tough plants. Something predatory watches from sparse cover. Farther back, in denser growth, a smaller synapsid moves through shade, looking for invertebrates and softer food. Above it all, conifers and seed plants stand against a sky streaked faintly by distant volcanic haze. Nothing here knows that it is ancient. Nothing here knows that its bones may one day be studied by minds not yet imaginable. It is only living. That, to me, is always the gentle sadness of paleontology. Every fossil we hold was once just a living body in a living place. A jaw was once hunger. A tooth was once need. A footprint was once weight passing over soft ground for a reason that mattered in that moment and never again. The rocks turn urgency into stillness. They do it so slowly that the transformation feels almost kind. Alongside the synapsids were early reptiles of several kinds, and the distinction between the major lineages of the time would shape the future deeply. Reptiles with different skull structures and different strategies were already moving into ecological spaces that would later expand dramatically. Some of these lineages would lead toward archosaurs, the broader group that would eventually include crocodilians, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs. In the age we are visiting now, they had not yet taken full command of the land, but the groundwork was forming. The supercontinent gave them room. The climate gave them pressure. Evolution gave them time. The amniotic egg remained one of the great liberating inventions in all this. It is difficult to overstate that. A shelled, protected environment for developing young meant freedom from the constant return to open water that bound amphibians so tightly to wet places. Amphibians still mattered on Pangea, especially near rivers, swamps, and wetter lowlands. Some were large, almost crocodile-like in outline, wading in muddy channels or shallow pools for prey. Others remained smaller and more generalized. But across the wider, dry country, their older dependents limited them. Reptiles and synapsids increasingly inherited the harsher spaces. The insects and other invertebrates still fed the land from below. Even as oxygen levels changed and the era of truly giant arthropods waned, invertebrates remained the hidden engine of terrestrial ecosystems. They broke down plant matter, recycled nutrients, consumed spores and leaves, fed vertebrates large and small. You can imagine the forest floor of a wetter Pangean woodland, and know that most of the important work was happening near the soil. Tiny bodies chewing, tunneling, burrowing, emerging. The visible world always rests on smaller labors. Plants, too, were shifting. The great Carboniferous swamp forests belonged more strongly to an earlier world, though their legacy still lived in coal beds and in the broader memory of ancient wet lowlands. In Permian Pangea, conifers, seed ferns, cycads, and other tougher plants played a greater role across many regions, especially as climates became drier and more seasonal. In the wetter coastal and riverine belts, forests remained dense enough to support complex food webs. In the interior, plant communities became harder, more sparse, more selective. A herbivore could not simply eat everything. It had to eat what endured. Sometimes, I think the whole story of Pangea can be told through the distribution of water. Water decides where forests gather. Water decides where amphibians breed. Water decides where herds move, where predators linger, where insects concentrate, where rivers become migration routes, where floodplains grow rich enough to leave behind thick fossil beds. And when water fails, everything changes together. In a supercontinent this large, the failure of water in the interior was not occasional. It was structural. It was built into the geometry of the land itself. That geometry also shaped weather in ways that would have felt dramatic on the ground. Seasonal monsoon systems likely brought concentrated rains to some margins of the continent. Rivers rose. Floodplains spread. Sediment moved in broad sheets. Then came drying again. In some places severe enough to reset entire communities. An animal surviving on Pangea had to survive not just a place, but a rhythm. Wet season, dry season, flood, drought, growth, contraction, rest, movement. Time on Pangea was written in long geological cycles. Yes, but also in seasonal pulses that every living body had to obey. And all through this, beneath the feet of every plant, eater, and every hunter, the crust remained restless. Pangea had been assembled through collisions, and those collisions left scars, uplifted ranges, faulted basins, and stressed seams throughout the land. Volcanoes and rift activity in different intervals reminded life constantly that Earth is never only a habitat. It is also an engine. Lava flows, ash beds, gas release, mountain building, erosion. All of it continued in the background, sometimes gently enough to vanish into deep time, sometimes violently enough to interrupt climate itself. Which brings us to the darker threshold of this story. Around 252 million years ago, at the end of the Permian, the world entered the event paleontologists call the Permian-Triassic extinction. The words sound clinical, almost soft. The reality was not soft. It was the greatest mass extinction Earth has ever known. We cannot know the lived sensation of that world in full. We only read the traces it left. But those traces are severe enough to quiet any room. Massive volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia poured lava across enormous regions and released extraordinary quantities of greenhouse gases and other compounds into the atmosphere. These eruptions, known as the Siberian traps, lasted over immense spans of time. Not one explosion, but prolonged geological violence. Carbon dioxide rose. Temperatures climbed. Ocean chemistry changed. Oxygen levels in the sea collapsed in many places. Acidification may have intensified stress further. On land, heat, drought, wildfires, and ecological disruptions spread through the already difficult systems of Pangea. This is one of those moments where even careful language struggles. Around 90% of marine species disappeared. On land, the losses were also catastrophic. Whole groups of animals vanished. Forest systems collapsed in many regions. Insects, who had survived so many older world changes, suffered one of the few major extinction crises known in their history. The lushness of many environments gave way to long intervals of simplification and scarcity. The world did not become completely empty, but it became quiet in a way that is almost painful to imagine. If you were standing on Pangea then, some days might have looked outwardly ordinary at first. Heat in the air, dry wind, a river running low. Yet behind those surfaces, the larger systems would be failing. Plant communities stressed, food webs thinning, species disappearing from one basin, then another. Fires in some places, dust in others. In the oceans, invisible suffocation. It was a planetary unmaking, slow enough to unfold over spans no individual animal could comprehend, fast enough to erase the deep inheritance of millions of years. And yet, because Earth is Earth, not everything died. Some synapsids endured. Some reptiles endured. Some plants endured. This is not a cheerful truth exactly, but it is a real one. The survivors were often small, adaptable, and efficient. They needed less. They could shelter more easily. They could reproduce more quickly or survive on narrower resources. In a collapsing world, flexibility becomes a kind of grace. Among the surviving lineages were the ancestors of later mammalian forms, as well as reptiles that would diversify spectacularly in the Triassic. The Great Dying did not simply end an age. It cleared ecological space on an enormous scale. Empty niches opened across land and sea, and into those emptied places, the survivors moved. Slowly at first, cautiously, then more boldly as recovery spread. I find there is something almost painfully tender in that image. A scorched and simplified world. Rivers still running in some places. Conifers and hardy plants returning where they can. Small bodies moving through wide silence. Life beginning again, not with triumph, but with persistence. That is the emotional center of Part 3 for me. Pangea was not only the age of unity, it was also the age in which Earth tested life so severely that only the patient lineages, the durable forms, the bodies willing to bend, were left to inherit the next world. And the next world was already gathering. In the long recovery after the extinction, the great supercontinent remained, but it was changing in atmosphere, ecology, and future potential. The old synapsid dominance had been broken. Reptilian lineages were about to rise into fuller prominence. The first true dinosaurs would eventually appear out of this transformed Triassic world. Early mammalian ancestors would persist in smaller forms, carrying their quiet inheritance through the shadow of larger rivals. The forests would regrow in altered composition. The climate would continue to strain and shift. And beneath it all, the same deep forces that once welded Pangea together were beginning, in hidden fractures, to prepare its long separation. So let the image soften now. The red ground cooling after sunset. A riverbed holding the last light. The silhouettes of old survivors moving in a world that has lost much of its former voice. Overhead, the sky no human has ever seen, stretched above one enormous continent, still whole for now, though not forever. In the next part, we will follow that recovering world forward, into the rise of new life, the first true dinosaurs, the early mammals in the undergrowth, and the quiet beginning of the cracks that would one day split Pangea into the continents we know. The world after the Great Dying was quieter, but it was not finished. I want to begin part 4 right there, in that altered stillness, because it is one of the most important moods in the whole story of Pangea. Imagine a river valley after catastrophe, not empty, but thinned. The old abundance gone. The old rulers broken. The ground still carrying memory of heat and ash. And yet there are tracks in the mud again. Small bodies moving. Hardy plants reclaiming light. Insects returning to their small, relentless labor. Life not triumphant, but steady. That is how the Triassic world begins. For millions of years after the extinction, at the end of the Permian, ecosystems rebuilt themselves piece by piece. Recovery in deep time is never sudden. Forests do not simply return in one season. Food webs do not knit themselves back together overnight. First come the durable forms, the ones that can live in poor conditions, on simplified landscapes, under climates still unstable. Then, if the planet allows it, complexity slowly follows. On Pangea, the planet allowed just enough. The supercontinent was still one enormous connected land, and that mattered more than ever. There were still no great oceans splitting major terrestrial populations from one another. A lineage that survived in one part of the continent could, over long spans, spread astonishingly far. Rivers still ran across the joined land. Seasonal belts still shifted with the monsoons and the heat of the continental interior. Mountain systems still shaped rainfall, and deserts still controlled huge spaces in the center. The geography that had once fostered synapsid diversity and tested life with harsh climates now became the stage for a different cast. Among the survivors and their descendants were small synapsids, edging closer to mammalian traits. They did not become giants in this age. Quite the opposite. Their power, if that is the right word, was subtle. Small bodies, quick lives, efficient feeding. Some may already have had whisker-like structures. Some may have carried insulation in the form of early hair, though direct evidence remains frustratingly rare and debated. They were not yet mammals in the full modern sense, but in them the blueprint grew sharper. Differentiated teeth, more active metabolism perhaps, brains and senses tuned for rapid response in crowded, dangerous environments. These little creatures tend to vanish emotionally behind the larger drama of dinosaurs, but I think they deserve our close attention. If you crouched at dusk along the edge of a Triassic woodland and watched carefully, they might be the first movements you would notice. Small forms slipping between roots, quick feeding in the undergrowth, a body pausing, alert, then vanishing again beneath cycads or conifer shade. They survived by avoiding notice, by living low, by making little use of size and much use of speed and flexibility. There is something deeply familiar in that strategy. Mammalian history begins, in many ways, with not being the loudest thing in the landscape. Meanwhile, another lineage was beginning to gather itself into the future. Archosaurs, a broad reptilian group that included the ancestors of crocodilians, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs, were diversifying. The Triassic was their testing ground. Some archosaurs remained low and heavily built. Others became more upright, more agile, with limbs positioned in ways that made movement more efficient over distance. Pangea rewarded that efficiency. This was a continent of long travel, wide dry zones, and ecological opportunities spread unevenly across huge regions. Bodies that could move well had an advantage. The first true dinosaurs emerged in this setting. Modest at first, they were not immediately the colossal icons people picture when they hear the word. Early dinosaurs were often relatively small, bipedal in some cases, quick, alert, and opportunistic. They entered ecosystems already occupied by many other reptiles and surviving synapsid relatives. Their eventual dominance was not instant. It was earned over millions of years through a combination of anatomy, timing, climate, and the repeated disturbances that kept resetting the rules of survival. I have always found that comforting in a strange way. Even giants begin quietly. The future rarely arrives at full size. Picture a floodplain in the Triassic interior margin, where a river cuts through seasonally dry country. There are conifers along wetter stretches. Cycads and seed plants stand in more open areas. The air is warm, perhaps humid after recent rains, or perhaps beginning to dry again under a broad sky. Across the mud run the tracks of several worlds at once. A small mammalian ancestor, a crocodile-line relative, an early dinosaur, a larger herbivorous reptile passing heavily toward water. This is what Pangea now becomes. A continent where lineages that will define the Mesozoic and later the Cenozoic share the same ground. Not as finished empires, but as unfolding possibilities. The plants of this age matter just as much as the animals. Recovery after the extinction did not restore the old Permian world exactly as it had been. New plant communities spread into the changed climates. Conifers became especially important across many regions. Their form and physiology suited them to a range of conditions, including seasonality and relative dryness. Cycads, with their sturdy trunks and crown-like leaves, became iconic elements of Triassic and later Mesozoic landscapes. Seed ferns still had roles in some places. Along rivers and wetter margins, denser vegetation could gather again, while farther inland, tougher forms held the ground. To walk through these recovering landscapes would be to feel the unevenness of return. Some valleys rich and green, some plains sparse but usable, some desert belts still broad and hard. Pangea's size kept this diversity wide and difficult. Moisture still struggled to reach the continental heart. The coasts and near-coastal regions remained more productive. The interior remained a country of endurance. But because the world was still one, species could spread across these gradients without an ocean blocking them. This connectedness continued to shape evolution in a way modern Earth does not. Fossils tell this story beautifully. Similar species or close relatives appear in rock formations on continents now far apart because they once belonged to the same broad terrestrial world. A creature could evolve in one region and, given enough generations, follow suitable habitat across thousands of kilometers of connected land. River systems helped. Seasonal vegetation belts helped. The lack of marine barriers helped most of all. In Pangea's age, distance was immense, but separation was not yet oceanic. The rivers themselves remained some of the most powerful organizing forces on the supercontinent. They rose in mountain belts formed by older collisions and traveled outward through basins, floodplains, and lowland forests. Some ended in coastal shallows. Others fed interior depressions. During wet seasons, they spread broad sheets of silt across the land. During dry intervals, they narrowed, concentrating life at their margins. Their banks held the richest soils, the thickest plant growth, the clearest routes of movement. Along these watercourses, the recovering world stitched itself back together. There is a very particular peace in imagining an ancient river at dawn. Mist lifting from the surface. Conifer silhouettes dark against the first light. Small reptiles basking on exposed banks once the sun rises. Insects beginning again. Tracks in yesterday's mud hardening as the day warms. Somewhere in the trees, one of those early mammalian forms foraging quickly before larger hunters fully stir. And somewhere farther out on open ground, a small dinosaur-line predator crossing from one patch of cover to another. This is not yet the Jurassic spectacle. It is something gentler and, to me, more intimate. The future arriving quietly through ordinary mornings. But Earth was still not finished disturbing the experiment. The Triassic world faced repeated stress from climate fluctuation and tectonic unrest. Beneath Pangea, the same mantle forces that once assembled the supercontinent were beginning to turn decisively towards separation. Rift zones formed where the crust stretched. At first, these were long valleys, faults, and localized volcanic systems. Nothing like a broad new ocean yet. More like wounds beginning to open in a body that still appeared whole from above. These rifts formed in several regions, but the most famous later consequences would involve the zones that eventually became the Atlantic Ocean, in what are now eastern North America, western Africa, and adjoining regions. The crust began to pull apart. Basins formed. Sediments accumulated in elongated valleys. Lava rose through faults. Vast basalt flows would later mark some of these rifting events. If you were walking Pangea then, you might encounter a landscape that felt subtly unstable. Escarpments, rift lakes, volcanic activity in the distance, ground that carried the beginning of future coastlines within it. It is debated in detail exactly how the timing and sequence of particular rift systems varied across the later Triassic and early Jurassic, because geology gives us a record that is broad, fractured, and sometimes difficult to synchronize perfectly. But the overall pattern is clear. Pangea was beginning to split. not dramatically at first. Quietly. Structurally, the future Atlantic began as strain. That strain affected climate too. As rifting progressed, topography shifted. New basins gathered water. Volcanism released gases that influenced temperature and atmospheric chemistry. Regions near the developing rifts could experience different rainfall patterns than before. Elsewhere, mountain uplift or fault-related changes altered drainage. The supercontinent still controlled global climate in a broad sense, but the first local disruptions of its unity were becoming visible on the ground. One of the most significant episodes tied to this long breakup process came near the Triassic-Jurassic boundary, when enormous volcanic outpourings associated with the Central Atlantic magmatic province released staggering quantities of lava and gas. This event, like so many geological crises, unfolded over time rather than in one cinematic blast. But its ecological consequences were serious. Climate stress intensified. Carbon dioxide rose. Environmental instability spread. Another extinction pulse followed, not as vast as the Great Dying at the end of the Permian, but important enough to remove many competing reptilian groups and open further space for dinosaurs to expand. That, in part, is why dinosaurs rose so strongly afterward. Not because they simply won in a fair, stable race, but because Earth kept reshuffling the board. Environmental crisis does not merely kill, it also redistributes opportunity. The groups that survive inherit emptiness. Dinosaurs were among those inheritors. Early Jurassic landscapes would increasingly belong to them. The little mammalian ancestors, meanwhile, did what their lineage would do for a long time. They persisted. Small. Quiet. Night-inclined, perhaps. Insect-eating. Seed-eating. Opportunistic. While larger reptiles took the visible spaces of the world, these early relatives of ours moved through shadow and shelter. This is worth remembering whenever deep time makes mammalian history feel secondary. Persistence is not secondary. It is its own kind of mastery. As the rifts widened, true seas would eventually invade some of them. Water from the surrounding global ocean entered the low places. Basins became narrow marine corridors. Then broader seaways. The once continuous land began to separate into the rough foundations of Laurasia in the north and Gondwana in the south. Though even those names hide a great deal of internal complexity and gradual change. The point is not the labels. The point is the farewell. Pangea, which had once brought nearly all land together, was beginning its long goodbye. It did not vanish in one age. For millions of years it remained recognizable, even as it cracked. Forests still stretched across huge distances. Rivers still crossed broad-joined terrains. Animal lineages still spread across what would later be divided continents. But the unity was weakening. New coastlines formed where there had once been interior valleys. Ocean currents began to change as new marine passages opened. Climate systems adjusted. Regions that had once been dry could become wetter with access to new moisture sources. Others, cut off in different ways, could harden further. The supercontinent's breakup was not just a tectonic story. It was a full planetary rewrite. And still, the memory of wholeness remained. The mountains built when continents collided did not vanish just because the crust later split. Ancient belts remained as worn seams in the land. The Appalachian system in North America and related structures in Europe and Africa still preserve that old contact in their roots. Rock strata still align across oceans because the oceans are younger than the mountains beneath the continents. Fossils still match across distant lands because distance came later. I find that one of the most moving aspects of Pangea's legacy, it is gone, but not erased. The continents carry its memory like separated family members who still have the same bone structure around the eyes. By the time the breakup advanced well beyond its earliest stages, the world that would become familiar to the later age of dinosaurs had begun to emerge. Narrow oceans widened. Continental populations separated. Evolution responded with new local paths. Dinosaurs diversified. Marine reptiles flourished in the changing seas. Flying reptiles took the air. Mammalian ancestors remained present. If often overlooked, Pangea had done its work. It had gathered life onto one terrestrial stage, allowed lineages to spread and compete on an immense scale, then divided them again so that new branches could grow in separation. If you stood on a high ridge during this long farewell, you might not know what you were witnessing. The ground beneath you would still feel permanent. The forests would still stand. Rivers would still move across their channels with the same grave patience. But beyond the next basin, or under the far haze, a rift might already be opening. Lava might already be cooling in great sheets. The future ocean might already exist as a fault line collecting rainwater in a long, silent valley. That is the tenderness of geological change. It does not usually announce itself in a language flesh can understand. It begins as strain, as heat, as a valley where there was once a plain, as water gathering where the crust is lowered. Only much later do maps reveal what was already underway. So let part 4 come to rest there, with the image of a once unified Earth beginning to separate while life continues to move through it. Dinosaurs taking their first larger steps into dominance. Early mammalian forms slipping through the undergrowth. Conifers lifting into changing skies. Rivers still joining landscapes that future oceans will divide. Pangea still present, but no longer secure in its wholeness. In the next part, we will follow that breakup more closely. Trace how the rivers, climates, mountains, and living lineages carried Pangea's memory into the world of separate continents, and listen for the echo of that ancient unity that still remains beneath our modern map. Now the world begins to separate in earnest. Though if you were standing on the ground, you might still feel as if nothing truly final had happened. That is one of the strangest things about deep time. A continent can be in the middle of ending, and yet to every creature walking across it, the land still feels solid, continuous, familiar underfoot. Pangea did not vanish in a single violent moment. It loosened. It strained. It opened along hidden lines until those lines became valleys. Those valleys became basins, and those basins slowly welcomed the sea. By this stage, the old supercontinent was no longer a single untroubled body. The crust had begun to thin in key regions. Heat rose from below. Magma found its way upward through widening fractures. along what would one day become the Atlantic margins. Long rift systems formed across the joined edges of lands, now called North America, Africa, and Europe. At first, these were not oceans, only low regions where the land pulled apart. Rivers ran into them. Lakes spread across their floors. Sediments gathered in quiet layers while volcanic stone hardened nearby, dark and heavy, carrying the first unmistakable signal that separation had begun. If you had wandered through one of these rift valleys, the place might have felt unnervingly new. Steep fault walls, deepening basins, water pooled where no large water had rested before. The air perhaps warm, perhaps thick with the mineral scent that follows volcanic activity. In some places, fresh lava fields would have cooled into black surfaces broken by steam and crack lines. In others, broad, shallow lakes reflected a sky that no longer stretched over a truly unified land. The change was slow, yes, but the geography was already learning a new language. The rise of rifting changed the rivers, too. For millions of years, Pangea's rivers had been the long stitching threads of the supercontinent, carrying sediment and life across immense joined terrains. Now some of those drainage systems were interrupted, redirected, or divided by faulting and uplift. A river that once crossed a broad plain could be captured by a sinking basin. Another might carve harder as the ground tilted beneath it. Some floodplains widened into fertile troughs beside the rifts, while others were stranded and dried. Water always reveals tectonic change before maps can. This matters because life on land follows water first, and only then the broader shape of continents. So as the crust opened, plants and animals responded immediately, even if no creature understood the cause. Wet lowlands beside active rifts became rich corridors. Ferns and conifers pressed close to the margins of lakes and streams. Insects gathered in humid belts. Small reptiles hunted along the edges. Early dinosaurs, still not yet the massive icons of later ages, moved through these landscapes with the alert confidence of animals entering opportunity. The world was fragmenting, but fragmentation can be fertile in its early stages. It is easy to think of breakup as a loss and nothing more. But there is another side to it. When land splits, edges multiply. Coastlines eventually increase. Basins fill. New rainfall patterns appear. New ecological borders form. On a whole supercontinent, the deep interior can become punishingly dry because moisture rarely reaches it. When that giant land starts to open, some of those old dry centers begin to lose their absolute power. New seas bring new air. New air brings new rain. The ending of Pangea was also the beginning of more varied climates than a single colossal landmass could easily sustain. That transition did not happen cleanly or all at once. Large portions of the interior remained dry for long spans. Great belts of red sediment still formed under arid conditions. Seasonal extremes still ruled many landscapes, but the broad logic had changed. Where Pangea once imposed endless continental interiors, the rifts began to invite coasts back into the story. In the midst of this, dinosaurs were steadily expanding their hold. They had survived earlier environmental disruption, and many competing groups had not. By the late Triassic and into the early Jurassic, that mattered enormously. Early Saurischians and Ornithischian ancestors spread through a continent that still allowed wide movement, but that was increasingly diverse in habitat. Some lineages remained light and bipedal, moving quickly across open ground. Others began exploring herbivorous lifestyles with greater commitment, feeding on the conifers, cycads, and other plants that now shaped recovering and reorganizing ecosystems. At the same time, the small mammalian ancestors did what they had been doing for a very long time. They persisted, perhaps nocturnal in many cases, likely cautious, feeding on insects, seeds, and smaller prey, living not in the center of the visual story, but in its margins. If you were there, in body, not in imagination, you might miss them entirely at first. A flicker under root shadow, a quick movement between stones, a small skull lowered to smell the damp edge of a stream. Yet in those small forms was another future as important as the dinosaur one. The larger world often belongs first to the loud. The longest inheritance sometimes belongs to the quiet. The plants of the breakup world deserve their own stillness. Conifers stood across many regions, tough enough for seasonality, strong enough for dry intervals, flexible enough to thrive in changing soils. Cycads, with their crown like heads and stiff leaves, gave many Triassic and early Jurassic landscapes an almost ceremonial look, as if every plain had its own watchful sentries rooted in place. Ferns spread quickly where disturbance opened ground. Along wetter belts, more complex plant communities gathered, especially where rivers met new low basins and where monsoonal systems still delivered dependable seasonal moisture. And the sky above this shifting land was changing too. With new seaways beginning to form, ocean air could move differently. Winds that once traveled over uninterrupted continental distances now met widening corridors of water. Rainfall increased in some places, dropped in others. Storm tracks adjusted. The soundscape of the world changed with the climate. More frogs and amphibious life in wetter basins. More insects in recovering green zones. More silence in the old interior deserts that still held their ground against change. One of the most dramatic geological expressions of this transition came with the huge volcanic episodes tied to continental breakup, especially the eruptions associated with what geologists call the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province. The name is modern and tidy. The event itself was neither. Lava poured out over vast areas. Carbon dioxide and other gases entered the atmosphere in heavy pulses. Climate systems lurched. Ocean chemistry shifted again. Another biological crisis followed near the Triassic-Jurassic boundary, removing still more competitors and further clearing the path for dinosaur dominance. It is a dark pattern, but a recurring one in Earth's history. Extinction and expansion often travel together. The land opens. The air changes. Some lineages fail. Others inherit what remains. Dinosaurs were among the great inheritors of this phase. They did not rise because the world was stable. They rose because the world was unstable in ways that favored their bodies, their metabolism, their reproduction, their ecological versatility. If you stood in one of the widening basins during those ages, you might have seen a world both wounded and beautiful. Fresh lava in the far distance. Forest belts close around water. Open plains beyond. Small dinosaur forms moving where older reptiles once dominated. A mammalian ancestor slipping out only when the light softened. In the sky above, dust and volcanic haze, sometimes washing the sunrise pale red. The planet was becoming multiple worlds, even before the oceans fully declared it. The sea itself now needs to return to the story. For so long, Pangea had been bordered by the enormous global ocean, Panthalassa, with the Tethys Sea lying along one great margin. As rifting advanced, marine waters eventually entered some of the open zones. At first, these were narrow incursions, thin bodies of water pressing into low land. But over immense spans they widened. Shorelines formed where once there had only been inland sediment basins. Tidal flats appeared. New marine ecosystems took root along the edges of splitting continents. This was one of the most profound consequences of breakup. A single giant continent imposes continental logic on climate. Multiple continents create coastline logic. More coasts mean more shallow seas. More shallow seas mean richer marine shelves. More marine shelves mean more ecological opportunity in both ocean and land margins. The breakup of Pangea did not simply rearrange maps. It multiplied edge environments, and edge environments are often where life becomes most inventive. Marine life responded accordingly. The seas of the Jurassic would become increasingly rich with ammonites, marine reptiles, fish, and complex shelf ecosystems. But even in the earlier stages of breakup, the groundwork was being laid. Nutrients from river systems entered new coastal zones. Shallow, warm waters spread over low continental margins. Sediments built deltas and lagoons. Reef systems and shelled life found room to diversify. The ocean that had once wrapped a single landmass was now beginning to push between pieces of it, and in doing so, it remade the possibilities of life. There is a certain melancholy to that image too. Water entering the fractures of an old world, the sea patient enough to wait for stone to fail. The mountains born during Pangea's assembly were still present, though many had long begun to erode. Ancient ranges shed sediment into the rift basins. Their worn flanks fed the lowlands with mineral-rich debris that built red beds, floodplains, and fertile margins. In the far future, geologists would read those sediments like a long farewell letter. This sand came from an old mountain built when continents collided. This basalt came when the crust began to fail. This fossil crossed a plain before the ocean divided its descendants forever. I think that is what gives the story of Pangea its emotional force. It is not simply that the continents were once together. It is that their togetherness and their separation are both still visible if you know where to look. Matching rock layers, fossils on different continents that should not match unless the continents once touched. Mountain roots aligned across modern oceans. The earth remembers itself with stubborn detail. As the breakup continued, broad northern and southern land groupings became more distinct. What would later be called Laurasia and Gondwana began to separate in a meaningful geographic sense, though within both there remained further fragmentation to come. India had not yet completed its astonishing later journey. Africa and South America still held together for long spans. Antarctica, Australia, and India still participated in larger southern configurations. The map was changing, but not yet toward its final form. Pangea's farewell was long, layered, and full of intermediate worlds that no longer exist. On land, dinosaur lineages continued to diversify within this changing geography. Some became larger and more imposing. Others specialized in feeding styles, movement patterns, or particular habitats. The great Jurassic sauropods and theropods belonged to a world made possible in part by this transition, by the ecological openings, climates, and continental spaces that followed from breakup. Yet even as dinosaur power expanded, the small mammalian line persisted beneath it, adapting to the new continents as they slowly emerged. The future was never singular. It was braided. And always there were the rivers. Even while seas opened, rivers still tied local worlds together. They cut through new valleys. They emptied into growing margins. They supported forests, floodplain herbivores, insect swarms, and nesting grounds. Their changing roots reveal the breakup almost as clearly as the lava does. To study ancient rivers is to watch land think with water. So let this part settle around a final image. A broad rift valley at evening. Conifers dark along its margins. A shallow lake lying still in the basin. Volcanic stone warm from the day. Small dinosaurs crossing open ground. Something mammalian moving under cover. Far away, a storm building over land that once had no such nearby sea. The air smells faintly of mineral dust and wet soil. Nothing in the scene is hurried. Nothing knows it is historical. But the world is changing beneath every footstep. In the next part, we will move closer to the coastlines and skies of this changing earth, follow the rivers into the seas, and listen to how the echo of one ancient continent remained written in mountain roots, ocean currents, fossils, and the living lineages that carried Pangea's memory forward long after the continent itself had gone. By now, the map in your mind should be loosening a little. That is good. Pangea asks for that. It asks you to release the neat certainty of the modern world and imagine instead a planet whose land once gathered into a single immense body, then slowly opened into pieces without ever entirely losing the memory of wholeness. In this part, I want to stay with that memory. Not only the splitting itself, but the echo that remained afterward in coastlines, currents, mountains, fossils, and the living inheritance carried by every later age. As the rifts widened and the first real ocean basins began to form, the earth entered a new visual rhythm. Shorelines lengthened. New beaches, deltas, lagoons, and shallow marine shelves appeared where there had once been interior plains. Water does not just divide land. It animates edges. It invites tides, estuaries, marshes, fisheries, storms, seasonal fogs, and the layered ecologies of coastlines. The breakup of Pangea multiplied all of these things. A world once defined by interior vastness gradually became a world of margins again. If you stood on one of those early new coasts, you would not have called it the birth of the Atlantic. You would only have seen a narrow sea or marine corridor pushing into the old land. Beyond the shallows, the horizon would still carry a sense of geological uncertainty. Cliffs of red sediment, basalt outcrops from earlier eruptions, river mouths bringing silt from ancient uplands, forests pressing near the shore, where moisture now reached more easily than it had in the old continental heartlands. The air itself would have felt changed. Salt on the breeze, more clouds, softer nights, more insects, more voices. Those new voices mattered to life. As shallow seas spread, marine ecosystems flourished along the continental shelves. Nutrients washed in from river systems. Warm waters supported shelled invertebrates, fishes, ammonites, and a wide array of marine forms that found opportunity in the newly opened habitats. Marine reptiles would later become some of the most dramatic presences in these waters, though their story belongs to the broader Mesozoic rather than to Pangea alone. What matters here is that the breakup increased ecological variety. A single supercontinent gives you immensity. Multiple coasts give you richness. On land, the changing coastlines altered climate patterns more deeply with each passing age. Regions that had once been dry because they lay too far from the sea now received seasonal moisture from nearby water bodies. Monsoonal circulation changed. Storm tracks adjusted. The great interior deserts of Pangea did not vanish at once, but their scale and influence gradually weakened as the continents separated and maritime air gained access to formerly isolated places. This is one reason the breakup is so central to the later story of life. It created new climates, and new climates create new possibilities. The rivers, patient as ever, adapted to these new worlds. Some once long continental systems were cut apart by the opening seas. Others found new routes, draining toward fresh margins instead of wandering into interior basins. Along their floodplains, life diversified. Dense vegetation stabilized soils. Herbivores fed in greater abundance. Predators followed. Nesting sites multiplied in wetter lowlands. Insects rose in warm air above river belts that now connected uplands to coasts rather than to the endless dry center of a supercontinent. And through all this, fossils were being laid down like quiet records for distant minds. Mud receiving footprints. Lake beds receiving bones. River sediments receiving leaves. Horn. Insects. Shells. It is extraordinary to think that the very act of the world changing helped preserve the evidence of that change. Rift lakes captured delicate traces. Volcanic ash sealed moments in place. Marine incursions buried shorelines under sediment. What we know of Pangea's farewell comes largely because the breakup made so many preserving environments possible. I have always found fossils to be gentler than ruins. Ruins speak of sudden abandonment. Fossils speak of patient transfer, a body becoming stone, a leaf becoming impression, a track becoming a paragraph in mud. Nothing hurries. Even catastrophe takes time to settle. The mountain roots left by Pangea's assembly remained one of the most eloquent parts of that record. Long before the breakup, collisions had built ranges whose descendants still define parts of the modern world. The Appalachians of North America, related structures in Greenland, Scotland, Scandinavia, and northwestern Africa all preserve traces of those old collisions. Today they are separated by the Atlantic, yet their rock types, structural patterns, and deep geological histories align across the ocean like divided sentences from the same lost page. Once, They stood in a single belt. Once, they were one mountain story. This is one of the deepest truths Pangea leaves us. Oceans are younger than many of the things they divide. The living world carried the same memory. Identical or closely related fossil species appear on continents now widely separated, because once they were not separated at all. Glossopteris, the famous seed fern, appears across southern continents because those lands were joined within Gondwana. Mesosaurus, a small freshwater reptile, is found in both South America and Africa, not because it crossed a broad ocean, but because there was no ocean there yet to cross. Dicenodon and Cynodon, relatives, early archosaurs, plant communities, and insect traces repeat this same pattern. The Earth preserved its old continuity through the distribution of life. As breakup continued through the Jurassic and beyond, dinosaurs spread across the newly formed continents and evolved in increasingly distinct ways as marine barriers widened. The old free movement of supercontinental life gave way to the more regional evolution familiar from later ages. Isolated populations diverged. New ecosystems took shape on different landmasses. Yet the early success of dinosaurs had been forged in the connected world of Pangea, just as the quiet resilience of mammalian ancestors had been tested there first. In that sense, even the divided world remained a child of the united one. The mammalian line is worth resting with once more. Through all the grandeur of reptilian expansion, these small forms endured, insect-eating, nocturnal, perhaps, warm-blooded in ways still developing, carrying more complex teeth and more flexible sensory worlds than many of the larger dominant animals around them. They survived continental rearrangement the way they had survived extinction, by not demanding too much from the world at once. Shelter, food, reproduction, care, persistence. Their great moment would come much later, after another extinction ended the age of non-avian dinosaurs. But their preparation for that future happened in the shadows of Pangea and its aftermath. The seas that opened after Pangea's breakup changed the planet's circulation profoundly. Ocean currents began to move through new pathways. Heat distribution shifted. The birth of the Atlantic eventually altered climate on a global scale. Panthalassa, once the overwhelming ocean girdling the supercontinent, gradually yielded some of its climatic dominance as new ocean basins gained size and structure. The Tethys Sea also played a major role in shaping climates and migration routes along the southern margins of Eurasia and the northern edges of Gondwanan fragments. These marine systems became not just physical spaces, but engines of planetary weather. Wind changed with them. The sky over the post-Pangean world no longer belonged to one continental pattern. Separate ocean basins, drifting landmasses, and different mountain arrangements created more regionally distinct climates. Some places became wetter, some colder, some more seasonal. The giant monsoonal breath of the supercontinent softened into more fragmented atmospheric rhythms. Yet even now, if you study monsoon systems in South Asia or Africa, or the interplay of continents and currents in the Atlantic, you are still looking at consequences that began in the old fractures of Pangea. And that is the remarkable thing. Pangea is gone, but not finished. Its memory remains in the way continents fit, in the shape of coastlines that seem to answer each other across the sea, in the matching mountain belts, in the continuation of rock units, in fossil distributions that ignore modern maps, in the atmospheric and oceanic systems born from its division, in the rise of lineages that first spread freely across one connected land. Even the quiet movement of today's tectonic plates belongs to the same supercontinent cycle that once assembled and then dismantled Pangea. Because Pangea was not the first supercontinent, and it will not be the last. Before it, there were earlier assemblies such as Rodinia and others whose exact forms are still argued over and refined by geologists. After it, in the far future, the continents may gather again into a new supercontinent of another shape, under another sky, carrying future life into climates and geographies we cannot fully imagine. The planet does not prefer permanence. It prefers motion. There is something almost deeply restful in that, if you let it be. Not because change is easy, but because change is fundamental. Mountains rise and wear down. Oceans open and close. Lineages flourish and fade. Continents gather and part. Nothing in Earth's story has ever remained fixed for long, and yet the whole system holds. A river changes course, but water continues. A forest composition shifts, but green returns. A continent breaks, but life finds new edges to inhabit. Deep time is severe, yes, but it is also full of continuities too large for any single age to contain. If you stood on a modern cliff overlooking the Atlantic and let your mind drift back far enough, you could almost use the ocean as an instrument of memory. Beneath it lies crust that opened as Pangea split. On either side of it stand lands once joined so closely that rivers, forests, and animals crossed between them without any sea at all. The waves you hear are moving over the scar of separation, but they are also moving over one of the clearest proofs that the world was once different from everything we know. And even now, the story continues under our feet. Tectonic plates still shift by centimeters each year. Earthquakes still release the tension of moving crust. Volcanoes still build and remake land. The Himalayas still rise through continental collision. The East African Rift still hints at future separation. The Atlantic still widens. The Pacific still closes in some regions. We are not outside the age of moving continents. We are simply inside a later chapter of it. For all its strangeness, Pangea leaves us with a surprisingly intimate lesson. The divisions we take for granted are temporary. The oceans that seem eternal are recent on geological timescales. The continents that look permanent are passengers on moving plates. The living world we know is built on inheritances from landscapes that no longer exist. In a very real sense, every forest, desert, mountain, and shoreline now alive is standing on the long aftersound of older worlds. Let the image widen now. See the final vastness of Pangea, not as a frozen map, but as a breathing world. Deserts in the interior, red and sunstruck. River systems threading green across their margins. Conifers in recovering belts after extinction. Early dinosaurs stepping lightly into ecological openings. Small mammalian ancestors moving under cover. Rift valleys dark with water and volcanic stone. New coasts hearing their first tides. And above all of it, a sky carrying dust, storm, season, and heat across one world that was becoming many. That is why Pangea endures in the imagination. Not merely because it was large, though it was immense. Not merely because it was ancient, though it belongs to a depth of time almost impossible to feel. It endures because it reveals the Earth in one of its clearest truths. The planet is connected before it is divided. Mountains, currents, air, stone, and life all belong to systems older and wider than the borders we draw. So as this part comes to rest, keep only a few simple things in the dim room with you. The sound of a river crossing a continent with no border. The shape of a mountain root now split by an ocean. The hush of a small mammalian form surviving beneath the stride of larger reptiles. The first sea entering a continental fracture. The knowledge that every map is temporary. And the feeling, quiet and almost impossible, that beneath every modern continent there still lingers the low, steady echo of one ancient land. In the final parts, we will gather these threads into a gentle closing reflection. Look at how Pangea still lives in the modern Earth beneath our feet, and end with the larger cycle itself. The possibility that one day, far beyond us, the continents may gather once again. Now we come to the quiet afterimage, the long echo that remains when the land itself is gone. Pangea does not survive on any modern map. You cannot point to it from an airplane window. You cannot stand on a political border and say the old supercontinent begins here and ends there. And yet it remains everywhere if you know how to look, not as a ghost in the mystical sense, but as a physical memory carried in stone, pressure, fossils, climate, and the slow movement of the living earth. Honestly, this is the part I find most moving. Not the assembly alone, not even the breakup, but the way the world remembers itself without needing to speak. A mountain remembers. A fossil remembers. A seam of rock on one side of an ocean remembers the matching seam on the other side. The memory is quiet, but it is exact. Take the mountains first. Many of the ranges we now think of as belonging to separate continents were once joined in the same tectonic story. The Appalachian Mountains in eastern North America are linked in deep geological ancestry to ranges in Greenland, the British Isles, Scandinavia, and northwestern Africa. Their rocks, structures, and ages align in ways that make no sense on a divided modern globe unless you restore the continents to their older positions. What now feels scattered was once continuous. What now seems distant was once shoulder to shoulder under one ancient sky. If you were standing in those mountain systems during the making of Pangea, you would not have seen national boundaries or future coastlines. You would have seen collision, crust rising, valleys deepening, rivers gathering snowmelt and stormwater, forests pressing against foothills, erosion beginning its patient work even before the uplift had finished. And then, across tens of millions of years, those mountains would begin to wear down, feeding sediment into basins, then into rivers, then into rifts, then into newly opening seas. The mountains that once helped stitch the world together eventually gave their stone to the landscapes that marked its separation. The fossil record keeps the same kind of patient account. Identical or closely related species appear on continents now separated by wide oceans because those continents were once joined. Glossopteris, the seed fern whose leaves appear across South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, And Australia is one of the clearest examples. Mesosaurus, a small freshwater reptile, appears in both South America and Africa, and its presence makes little sense if those lands had always been divided by saltwater. Freshwater animals do not casually cross oceans. The continents once touched. The rocks say so. The fossils say so. The old world left a matching signature in places now far apart. You know that feeling when a puzzle piece suddenly turns the right way and the whole picture becomes unavoidable. That is what Pangea is like in geology. Not a guess, not a mood, but a fit. Coastlines fit roughly. Mountain belts fit more deeply. Rock sequences fit more carefully. Fossils fit most tenderly of all, because they remind us that life itself once moved across a united Earth in ways modern geography no longer permits. This continuity shaped the future of life more profoundly than it first appears. Dinosaurs, mammals, crocodilian ancestors, conifers, cycads, marine lineages, all of them developed under conditions influenced directly or indirectly by the supercontinent and its breakup. The vast dry interiors of Pangea favored some adaptations and punished others. The connected land allowed migration on extraordinary scales. The later fragmentation created isolation, and isolation encouraged divergence. In one phase, unity spread lineages. In the next, division diversified them. Both phases were necessary. The old whole and the new fragments worked together to create the richness of the later world. Even the oceans we know today are children of that long change. The Atlantic did not exist during Pangea's maturity. It opened afterward, slowly, as rifts widened and marine waters advanced into them. The Indian Ocean, too, belongs to a later arrangement of drifting fragments. Modern current systems, the broad circulation of heat through water that shapes climate on almost every coast on Earth, depend on the positions of continents that were established through and after the breakup of Pangea. In that sense, every breeze softened by nearby sea, every wet coastal winter, every monsoonal shift, still carries consequences that began when the old supercontinent started to fail. And the atmosphere, always moving, kept changing with it. Under Pangea, one enormous landmass created planetary scale, continental climates, especially in the interior. After breakup, smaller continents and widening seas created more coastal zones, more maritime moderation, more climatic complexity. Rain could reach places it once could not. Interior deserts shrank in some phases and shifted in others. Storm tracks moved. Ocean evaporation fed newly accessible regions. The planet did not become calmer exactly, but it became more partitioned in its climates. One giant seasonal machine gave way to many regional systems. The traces of ancient deserts also remain. Red beds, dune deposits, evaporites, and dry basin sediments still mark where great arid belts once lay in the interior of the old supercontinent. When geologists map those deposits across now distant continents, the dry heart of Pangea emerges again. It is almost like watching a vanished climate rise back through the ground. A world of dust, heat, sparse rivers, and hard-adapted life can be rebuilt from sediment alone. Then there are the basalts, the heavy volcanic records of continental strain and rupture. When breakup accelerated, huge volumes of magma entered the crust and sometimes erupted across astonishing areas. Those rocks remain too, dark, dense, and still arranged in patterns that reveal the hidden geometry of rifting. They are some of the clearest evidence that the land did not merely drift apart politely. It was stretched, heated, broken, remade from below as much as from above. I have always found it strange that people think of continents as calm things. They look calm because our lives are short. But continents are only calm in the same way a glacier is calm, or a sleeping animal is calm. Motion exists. It is simply too slow for ordinary intuition. Pangea helps correct that illusion. It reminds us that the ground has a biography. The biological memory is just as compelling. During the Permian and Triassic, Synapsids, early archosaurs, early dinosaurs, and many smaller forms lived in landscapes shaped by the supercontinent's extremes. Some lineages survived the Great Dying and rebuilt the world. Others failed and disappeared almost completely. The small mammalian ancestors that persisted beneath larger, more dramatic faunas remained part of the story all along. Their eventual success came much later, but their endurance during Pangea and its aftermath was the foundation of that future. Dinosaurs, too, owe much of their early expansion to the connectedness and later restructuring of this world. While Pangea remained broadly joined, dinosaur ancestors could spread widely. As the land later fragmented, populations became increasingly isolated, and that isolation encouraged regional evolution. The age of giant sauropods, formidable theropods, and specialized herbivores was built on this transition from unity to fragmentation. Pangea gave them a stage large enough to begin. Breakup gave them separate theaters in which to diversify. The plant world tells the same story in quieter textures. Conifers that could survive seasonality and dryness spread widely. Cycads and seed ferns occupied broad belts of the supercontinent. Ferns recolonized disturbed ground after volcanic or climatic stress. Later, plant communities shifted with changing moisture regimes as new seas altered regional rainfall. Every leaf impression in sediment, every pollen grain preserved in stone, becomes part of the larger record. Forests do not last forever, but their outlines can endure in rock long enough to tell us how air and climate once moved across a continent no longer present. By this point in the story, the most important thing may be the simplest. Pangea is gone, but Earth never stopped being one system. The land divided. Yes. The coastlines lengthened. The oceans widened. Life differentiated. But water, air, heat, chemistry, plate movement, and evolution never became separate stories. They remained braided together. That is why the echo of Pangea matters. It is not nostalgia for a vanished map. It is recognition that the modern world is built from long continuity rather than isolated episodes. If you walk a modern shoreline and pick up a stone, it belongs to a story deeper than the coast before you. If you look at a fossil in a museum drawer, silent under soft light, it may carry proof that two continents once met. If you study a mountain's root rock, you may be touching an ancient collision zone, older than the ocean now separating its halves. And if you simply breathe and listen to rain moving in from the sea, you are living inside climate systems made possible by continental movements that began before mammals became important and before flowering plants ruled the land. There is also a future tucked inside all this. Pangea was not the first supercontinent. It will not be the last. The Earth appears to move through long supercontinent cycles. Earlier worlds assembled and broke apart before Pangea ever formed. In the distant future, if plate motions continue in broadly familiar ways, the continents may gather again into another supercontinent. Its exact shape is uncertain. Geologists have imagined several possibilities. Amasia, Pangea Proxima, Orica. Names for hypothetical futures written with a mixture of mathematics and imagination. We cannot be sure which pattern, if any, will fully emerge, but the possibility itself matters. What once happened on Earth may happen again in another form. That thought can feel unsettling at first. The ground beneath us not fixed. The oceans temporary. The familiar map only a chapter. But there is comfort in it too. Deep time teaches flexibility without panic. Continents join. Continents part. Life suffers. Life recovers. Systems fail. Systems reorganize. The planet does not promise ease, but it does reveal continuity. So if Part 5 was the long opening of the old world, and Part 6 was the widening of its fractures, then this part is the still room afterward, the place where we realize nothing was truly lost without leaving traces, and nothing modern stands free from those traces now. The world beneath your feet is not simply present tense stone. It is memory under pressure. Let the image narrow one last time. A museum hall at closing hour. Low light on fossil leaves. A split slab, showing tracks in ancient mud. A polished cross-section of basalt from an old rift. A wall map with the continents slid back together in their older shapes. No drama. No noise. Just the hush of evidence waiting for someone to look long enough. If you were standing here with me, I think this is the moment I would speak most softly, because this is where the story becomes less about lost worlds and more about recognition. It is debated in detail exactly how different regions responded at the same rate or in the same order during breakup. Some basins opened earlier. Some remained linked longer. Some climates shifted faster than others. We cannot be sure of every local sequence, because the record is incomplete in places, and later geology has altered parts of it. But the larger pattern is clear enough to rest in. One world became many. One immense climatic machine became several interacting ones. One connected terrestrial stage became a set of drifting theaters where evolution would begin composing more regional stories. There is a human comfort in naming periods and boundaries. Permian, Triassic, Jurassic. Before breakup, after breakup, but the Earth itself does not honor our neat divisions. Somewhere, for a very long time, an old Pangean landscape and a new post-Pangean one existed at the same time in different places. One basin still dry and interior, another already touched by an early sea. One forest still belonging to the old continental logic. Another already responding to new coastlines and new rainfall. That overlap matters, because it reminds us that worlds do not switch off. They blend into one another slowly, like evening becoming night. In the final part, we will let the story settle completely, return to the living earth around us, and close with the deepest lesson Pangea offers, that our world has always been larger, stranger, and more connected than it first appears. So now we come to the final quiet. The fire has burned low. The old supercontinent has already opened, drifted, and given away its shape to the long future. Dinosaurs rose and fell after it. Mammals emerged more fully into the light after it. Flowering plants came later. Ice ages came later. Humans came very much later. And yet the age of Pangea remains underneath all of it like a deep foundation, not visible at first glance, but holding more of the modern world than we usually realize. If you step outside in the present and look at the Earth as it appears now, everything seems divided. Continents separated by wide oceans. Islands isolated by salt water. Mountain chains broken into national fragments. Species sorted into geographic regions. We are taught this version of the world so early that it begins to feel natural, inevitable, almost permanent. But Pangea reminds us that none of this arrangement is permanent. It is a temporary geometry in a restless system. I think that is one reason the old supercontinent continues to hold people so strongly. It does not merely reveal a lost map. It reveals that the map itself is never the deepest truth. Beneath every border is crust in motion. Beneath every ocean is a history of opening or closure. Beneath every modern ecosystem is a line of inheritance that passed through climates, landforms, and extinctions almost impossible to imagine from the comfort of the present. And maybe that is why the story feels so soft at the end. Not because it is simple. It is not simple at all. It is full of fire, drought, extinction, collision, and separation. But because when you sit with it long enough, all that violence becomes pattern. The pattern does not excuse the suffering built into natural history. The great dying was real. Volcanic winters and greenhouse crises were real. Ecosystems vanished. Dominant groups failed. Entire landscapes changed their meaning. Still, life persisted. The land changed shape. The air changed composition. The sea moved in. The sea moved out. And the world continued writing itself. You know that feeling when you stare at a modern globe and it suddenly becomes strange again? Not in a frightening way, but in a widening way. Africa and South America almost touching in your imagination. The Atlantic not ancient, but young. India not where it always belonged, but a traveler. Antarctica not eternally frozen, but once joined to warmer lands in a southern assembly. The Earth becomes less like a finished object and more like a sentence still being written. That feeling is part of what Pangea gives us. The fossils hold it gently. A reptile in South America answering one in Africa. A seed fern in Antarctica answering one in India. Matching species speaking across oceans that did not yet exist. The mountains hold it too. Rock belts, broken by later water, but still aligned in age and structure. The atmosphere carries it. Ocean currents carry it. Even the simple fact That a coastal climate feels different from an inland one carries the inheritance of how continents are arranged, and that arrangement is the child of earlier arrangements before it. In some ways, Pangea was a world of excess. Excess land, excess distance, excess interior dryness, excess continental scale. A place where a creature might walk for seasons without meeting an ocean. A place where weather could cross enormous uninterrupted space. A place where deserts reached outward beyond any human measure. But in another sense, it was also a world of intimacy, because everything terrestrial belonged to one connected body. Plants spread across joined lands. Animals migrated without marine barriers. The sky arched over one continuous continent. The same tectonic pulse fed mountains, rivers, faults, and volcanic systems within one shared physical frame. That combination of immensity and intimacy is rare, maybe unique in the way Pangea expressed it. And it mattered. It shaped evolution. It altered climate. It set the stage for the rise of reptiles after amphibian dominance, for the persistence of mammalian ancestors during harder ages, for the later spread and diversification of dinosaurs, and for the marine and atmospheric systems that followed from Breakup. Pangea was not simply a background for life. It was an active participant in life's direction. Some scholars focus on the tectonics, which makes sense. Some on the climates, some on the extinction at the end of the Permian, or the Archosaur rise after it, or the evidence of continental fit preserved in rocks and fossils. All of that matters. But there is also a quieter insight. The world is more connected than it appears at any single moment. What seems separate now may have been joined before. What seems stable now may be passing through a brief arrangement. What seems distant may share a root if you look deeply enough. If you stood on the modern Atlantic shore at dusk and let your thoughts move backward, you could almost feel the hidden nearness of the lands across from you. Not because the distance is small, it is vast, but because the distance is young compared to the deeper age of their former union. The waves would keep moving. The birds would keep calling. Salt would remain in the air. Yet beneath all that ordinary modern evening would lie the memory of a fracture that opened slowly over millions of years. The ocean would become not just water, but time made visible. And if instead you stood high in a mountain range and touched stone exposed by wind and cold, you might be touching the compressed remains of a collision zone born when continents drove together to make the supercontinent. A mountain is never only a mountain. It is a former seabed lifted upward, a collision written in mineral grains, a source of later river sediment, a participant in climate, a witness to breakup. The Earth is full of these layered identities. Pangea helps us notice them. The future, too, becomes softer once you accept that nothing about the planet's surface is final. Continents are still moving now. The Atlantic still widens. The Pacific still changes. Africa continues to shift. India is still pressing into Asia. The East African rift hints at possible future division. Somewhere far beyond our species, beyond our civilizations, beyond our languages, the continents may gather again. Another supercontinent may form under another sky, with other winds and other lineages living across its joined land. We cannot know its exact shape. It is debated. It is modeled. It is imagined. but the cycle itself seems real. That means the Earth we live on is not the last version of itself. It is one arrangement in an ongoing sequence. There is humility in that. But there is also relief. The world does not demand permanence from us because it does not keep permanence for itself. And perhaps that is the best place to rest. Not in spectacle, but in scale. The scale of the land. The scale of the waiting. The scale of the forces below the crust. Always moving. Always shaping. Always preparing the next arrangement. Nothing about Pangea was hurried. Its making took ages. Its life unfolded over ages. Its ending took ages. Even the disasters within its story, terrible as they were, settled into meaning only across spans of time so wide that no single living thing could ever have grasped them as a whole. If you were standing here with me beside the last glow of the fire, I would ask you to imagine just one final motion. Not dramatic, not violent. Only the slow drift of plates beneath oceans and continents right now, tonight, while everything appears still. A few centimeters in a year. Barely anything by human measure. Yet given enough time, enough patience, enough Earth, those centimeters will redraw the globe. Another ocean will narrow. Another coastline will stretch. Another mountain will rise. The map will loosen again. So the old supercontinent offers more than history. It offers perspective. What feels fixed is not fixed. What feels separate is often secretly joined. What feels final is rarely final on a living planet. The Earth does not hold one shape. It keeps composing itself from fracture and reunion, from uplift and erosion, from drought and flood, from extinction and renewal. Pangea was one verse in that composition, but a powerful one, because it gathered almost all land into a single body and then let us watch, through rocks and fossils and restless crust, how such a body comes apart without losing its influence. Outside the window of the mind, the modern world remains. Coasts lit by moonlight, forests breathing, rivers moving toward seas that were born from old fractures, mountains standing in weather they helped create, deserts lying over sediments carried from vanished uplands, cities built on crust that remembers older climates, older skies, older neighbors across now, open water. We live entirely within inheritance. And beneath that inheritance is the oldest, quietest reminder of all. The world is connected before it is divided. That was true in the age of Pangea. It is true now, though harder to see. Air still circles the whole planet. Water still moves heat from one hemisphere to another. Dust still crosses oceans. Birds migrate across continents. Currents link coasts that never touch. Life remains entangled with geology, climate, and time in ways no border can undo. So let your thoughts lie down with that. One ancient continent. One immense ocean around it. Forests, deserts, mountains, and rivers without the separations we now assume. Fire below, wind above. Life testing itself in a world at once harsh and open. Then the long fracture. The entering sea. The widening basins. drifting lands. The continued pulse of the earth, carrying everything forward. Some scholars prefer to keep emotion out of geology entirely, and I understand that instinct. The rocks are enough. The evidence is enough. But it is also true that when we look at something this old and this large, feeling arrives on its own. Awe, smallness, calm, a kind of hush. Not because the earth is comforting in the way a gentle room is comforting, but because its continuity is so much greater than our immediate fears. The continents have already been together. They have already parted. They are still moving. The world has survived versions of itself that would be unrecognizable to us, and yet the line from those worlds to this one was never fully broken. When we say that Pangea is gone, what we really mean is that its shape is gone. Its materials remain. Its consequences remain. Its biological experiments remain. Its tectonic logic remains inside the motion of the plates. Even the great extinctions associated with its history remain in the structure of later life, because survival always becomes inheritance. The creatures that endured the hardest intervals passed forward not only their genes, but their solutions. Efficient lungs, better posture, new teeth, new metabolism, new tolerance for heat or dryness or ecological uncertainty. In that sense, deep time is a slow accumulation of answers to ancient questions. Think too of the rivers, because rivers were among the gentlest powers in the whole story. They crossed the old supercontinent without regard for future continents. They fed the floodplains where animals gathered. They moved mountain stone grain by grain toward low basins and coastal shelves. They changed course as rifts opened. They kept flowing as climates shifted. A river on Pangea did not know it was part of a supercontinent. It only knew gravity, rainfall, slope, and time. Yet, through such simple loyalty to motion, rivers help stitch together ecosystems, climates, and sedimentary archives that we still read now. The forests carry a similar tenderness. Seed ferns, conifers, cycads, fern fields after disturbance, swamp belts where humidity held. These were not decorative backgrounds for giant creatures. They were atmosphere makers, soil binders, shade givers, nurseries for insects, reptiles, and mammalian ancestors. When volcanic crises and climate change cut many of them down, the world felt it immediately. Oxygen, moisture, habitat, food, all of it altered. And when forests returned, even in changed form, they did not merely cover the land again. They rebuilt relationships. That is the larger pattern at the heart of the story. Pangea was never only rock. It was always relationship. Land and sea, river and basin, heat and air, plant and animal, extinction and opportunity, connection and separation. Every part of it leaned on every other part, and that leaning continues in the modern world whether we notice or not.